Westminster Hall, May 1533. The space is overwhelming. 240 feet of stone and soaring Gothic arches packed with bodies generating stifling heat despite the late spring air outside. Anne Boleyn sits alone at the high table under a cloth of estate, physically separated from everyone, elevated, untouchable. The Countess of Oxford stands beside her through the entire meal, holding a napkin, not sitting, standing, in a gesture of submission so deliberate it borders on theatre. Dishes arrive in waves, not courses as we'd understand them, but landscapes of food presented simultaneously. 30 dishes in the first course alone, perhaps 100 across the entire feast. Swans in full plumage. Peacocks reassembled after roasting to look alive. Pies containing birds nested inside other birds. Sugar sculptures of Anne's falcon badge, crowned, standing triumphant on Tudor roses. Everything gilded, spiced, exotic, excessive. The Earl of Sussex himself serves her. The Duke of Norfolk, her own uncle, performs ceremonial duties, bowing, presenting dishes, enacting submission. This is the pinnacle. Anne is queen, visibly pregnant with what everyone prays will be a male heir, presiding over a feast designed to communicate one thing. Henry's break with Rome hasn't weakened England. And anyone who doubts Anne's legitimacy can watch the entire nobility of England bend the knee while she eats. 3 years later, many of these same men, Norfolk included, will sit on a jury and condemn her to death for treason. She'll spend her final days imprisoned in the same tower apartments where she dressed for this coronation, eating monitored meals under the watch of spies, waiting for a French swordsman to take her head. The feast was meant to make her immortal. It did, just not the way she imagined. The atmosphere in Westminster Hall that day was magnificent, and wrong. Contemporary witnesses recorded the splendor in beautiful detail. The cloth of gold, the pageantry, the sheer scale, but also noted something missing. Genuine celebration. This wasn't a gathering of people who wanted to be there. It was a gathering of people who understood what happened to those who stayed away. Catherine of Aragon's supporters were notably absent. Their empty seats a silent protest no amount of gold leaf could cover. Those who did attend performed their roles with precision. They bowed at the right moments. They observed protocol. They smiled. But the event had the quality of a command performance, and everyone knew it. Anne had been Henry's mistress while Catherine was still queen. The Pope had refused to annul Henry's first marriage. So Henry had broken with Rome entirely, torn England's religious allegiance apart, and placed this woman, daughter of a knight, former lady-in-waiting, pregnant with dubious legitimacy, on the throne. The banquet was Henry's way of forcing acceptance through spectacle. You will watch. You will participate. You will treat her as sacred. The physical setup reinforced this. Anne sat alone under a canopy that marked her as quasi-divine, a space ordinary people couldn't enter. She didn't eat with others. She was observed eating. The separation wasn't just about status. It was about creating visual proof of her elevation for the hundreds watching and the thousands who would hear about it later. Every gesture was choreographed. Every detail mattered. The hall itself contributed to the unreality. Torches and candles fought against the shadows in the massive space. Fires roared in the kitchens beyond, sending waves of heat. The smell would have been overwhelming. Roasted meat, spiced wine, perfumes worn by nobles, sweat. The rushes on the floor already soaking up spills. Musicians played throughout, but their role was as much to fill uncomfortable silences as to entertain. Anne was newly crowned, newly pregnant, newly powerful. She had achieved what seemed impossible. And she must have known she was too intelligent not to how fragile it all was. The feast wasn't designed to be eaten. It was designed to be seen, recorded, and remembered as proof of Anne's unassailable position. Each course contained dozens of dishes presented simultaneously. Not because anyone could consume that much, but because the abundance itself was the message. Reports suggest the full banquet included upwards of 80 preparations, possibly more. The precise number mattered less than the impression: endless, overwhelming, imperial. The symbolism was embedded in every dish. Swans, royal birds that commoners were forbidden to hunt, arrived roasted but reconstructed in their feathers. Peacocks came gilded and reassembled to look alive. Their tail feathers fanned, symbols of resurrection and immortality, appropriate for a queen whose marriage was supposed to herald a new era. Pike and porpoise represented mastery over water, a pointed reminder that England was an island power. Venison announced control over forests and hunting rights reserved for royalty. Then there were the subtleties. Sugar sculptures that functioned as edible propaganda. Anne's personal badge, the falcon, appeared crowned and perched on a stump with red and white roses growing from it. The imagery wasn't subtle at all. Anne's heraldic symbol literally standing triumphant over the Tudor rose. Roots growing. Future secured. These sculptures cost more to produce than many craftsmen earned in months. Sugar itself was a luxury import. Its presence in such quantities was a statement that England's break with Catholic Europe hadn't severed its trade networks. Exotic spices: cinnamon, cloves, pepper, saffron appeared in nearly every dish. Their expense and foreign origin demonstrated reach and wealth. Sauces required days of preparation. Their complexity was a showcase of kitchen mastery. Jellies made from clarified stock set with isinglass shimmered on platters. Pastries arrived covered in gold leaf, literally gilded excess. But the most potent symbolism wasn't the food itself. It was who served it. The Earl of Sussex acted as chief server. Other nobles carved meat, poured wine, and presented dishes to Anne beneath her canopy. Each act of service was a public performance of submission. These were men of ancient lineage, some wealthier than Anne's family had been only a generation earlier, now ritually enacting subservience to her authority. The Duke of Norfolk, Anne's own uncle, played a prominent role in orchestrating the event. He smiled. He bowed. He ensured everything unfolded flawlessly. 3 years later, he would preside as Earl Marshal over the trial that condemned her, overseeing her destruction with the same efficiency he had once devoted to her celebration. Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, attended the festivities. Years earlier, he had been romantically involved with Anne before their relationship was broken apart to make way for her royal marriage. In 1536, he sat on the jury that found her guilty of adultery and treason, reportedly collapsing after delivering the guilty verdict. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, Henry's oldest friend, also participated in the coronation events. He would later become one of Anne's most vocal enemies, actively helping construct the case against her. The faces smiling at her across Westminster Hall, the hands serving her food, the voices proclaiming her glory, many of them would pivot without hesitation when Henry's favor turned. This was how Tudor politics functioned. Loyalty was performed, not felt. Favor was temporary. Survival was paramount. Everyone understood that today's honored guest could become tomorrow's traitor, depending entirely on the king's mood. The feast was theatre. Every participant knew their lines. They also knew the script could change. The reversal took only 3 years. Not a gradual decline, but a sudden collapse that must have felt like reality itself breaking. In April 1536, Anne was still queen. Still presiding over her court. Still theoretically secure. By May 19, she was dead. The mechanism was simple. Henry wanted out. Anne had failed to produce a male heir. Elizabeth had been born in September 1533, followed by miscarriages. By 1536, Henry had fixed his attention on Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. The pattern was repeating. Just as Anne had replaced Catherine while serving her, Jane was now positioned to replace Anne. But Catherine had been divorced. Anne would need to be destroyed. The accusations were calculated for maximum legal efficiency. Adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The charges were almost certainly fabricated. But their specific nature transformed infidelity into treason. A queen's adultery wasn't merely betrayal. It threatened the legitimacy of royal succession, making it a crime against the state itself, punishable by death. Mark Smeaton, a court musician of low birth, confessed under torture to sexual relations with Anne. The other accused men denied everything. It didn't matter. The outcome was predetermined before the trial even began. On May 15, 1536, Anne stood before 26 peers in the King's Hall of the Tower of London. Around 2,000 spectators watched. She had no legal counsel. She defended herself with clarity and force, denying every charge. But she must have understood the futility. This was theatre, not justice. The jury included men who had celebrated her coronation. Henry Percy was there. The former lover whose relationship with Anne had been sacrificed years earlier to clear her path to Henry. He delivered the guilty verdict. Then he collapsed. Whether from guilt, grief, or simply the strain of the performance, we don't know. The Duke of Norfolk, her uncle, presided over the proceedings as Earl Marshal. He showed no emotion. He possessed the kind of talent for survival that demanded flexibility above loyalty. The verdict came in after less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was death by burning or beheading, at the king's pleasure. Henry chose beheading. In what may have been an act of mercy or perhaps simple expedience, he summoned an expert French swordsman from Calais instead of using the traditional English executioner's axe. The 5 accused men were executed on May 17. Anne remained imprisoned in her Tower apartments. She could hear the preparations. She knew her brother had just been killed on Tower Hill for crimes he never committed. The executions served 2 purposes: psychological torture, political messaging. Everyone connected to Anne was being erased. The erosion of her power had begun long before the arrests. Anne's position had always been precarious. It rested on Henry's passion rather than political alliances or widespread public support. When that passion cooled, the foundation cracked. The pregnancy that had blessed her coronation produced Elizabeth in September 1533. A daughter. Not the male heir Henry had torn England's church apart to secure. Anne conceived again. Miscarriage. Another pregnancy. Another miscarriage. With every loss, Henry's frustration hardened into something colder. By early 1536, Jane Seymour had captured his attention. She played the role Anne herself had once mastered. Demure. Reserved. Just out of reach. A promise of the fresh start Henry perpetually craved. Jane's family positioned her carefully. The Seymour faction at court quietly grew stronger. Then came January 29, 1536. Anne miscarried a male child, approximately 15 weeks into the pregnancy. Far enough along that the baby's sex could be identified. The timing could not have been worse. That same day, Catherine of Aragon was buried. To observers searching for omens, it appeared cosmically ordained. Henry's reported response was devastating. I see that God will not give me male children." This wasn't grief speaking, it was political calculation disguised as divine judgment. If God was withholding sons, then the marriage itself must be cursed. The very argument Henry had once used against Catherine was now being turned against Anne. The acceleration was shocking. April 30, Mark Smeaton was arrested. May 1, Anne attended the justs at Greenwich as Queen, watching the tournaments from the royal box. Henry left abruptly in the middle of the event. Anne never saw him again. May 2. Anne was arrested. She was taken by barge to the Tower of London, entering through the Watergate where prisoners arrived. It was the very same river approach she had taken just 3 years earlier in triumph. Then, the Tower had housed her pre-coronation apartments while the city celebrated her rise. Now she was confined to the Queen's lodgings, the very same rooms where she had prepared for her coronation. The psychological cruelty was either deliberate or grimly coincidental. Either way, it was devastating. The chambers that had once represented her greatest ascent had become her prison. From the windows, she could see Tower Green, where the scaffold was already being built. She reportedly asked her attendants whether she would be burned or beheaded, trying to understand the mechanics of her approaching death. The women attending her were not companions. They were spies, carefully selected to report everything Anne said to Thomas Cromwell, the man constructing the legal case against her. Nothing was private. Every word spoken at meals, every nighttime prayer, every moment of fear, hope, despair, or defiance, everything was documented and could be turned against her. At first, Anne apparently didn't understand this. She spoke with desperate candor before realizing the trap. She moved constantly between hope and despair. At times, she believed exile might still be possible. Perhaps France. Perhaps a convent. Catherine of Aragon had been banished but allowed to live. Why shouldn't the same happen to her? But Catherine had been a foreign princess with powerful relatives across Europe. Anne was English. The daughter of a knight. She had no foreign family to protect her. More importantly, Henry didn't simply want Anne removed. He wanted her dead. He intended to marry Jane Seymour. That required Anne not merely to disappear, but to be legally condemned and executed, removing any doubt about the legitimacy of his next marriage. May 15. The trial. Anne entered knowing the likely outcome. Still, she defended herself with remarkable clarity. She denied every accusation. The jury watched her. Some of those men had once served her at the magnificent coronation banquet. The same hands that had once carried her food now sat in judgment over her life. Their deliberation was brief. They delivered the only verdict Henry would accept. May 17. The men accused alongside Anne were executed on Tower Hill. George Boleyn, her brother, was beheaded. The others soon followed. Anne remained inside her apartments. Whether she heard the executions themselves or only their aftermath, she knew she would be next. These were men who had once been her friends. Court companions. Trusted allies. Now they were dead simply because they had been associated with her. 2 more days passed. On May 18, Anne was informed that her execution would take place the following morning. The French swordsman had already arrived from Calais. She spent the night in prayer. Witnesses later described her as strangely calm. She requested that the consecrated sacrament be brought to her chamber. She wished to swear before God that she was innocent. In the 16th century, lying before the Eucharist meant risking eternal damnation. It was one of the strongest declarations of innocence a Christian could make. Whether her jailers granted that request remains uncertain. The surviving sources do not clearly record it. Anne spent her final days inside rooms originally built for celebration. They had become a gilded cage. The Queen's lodgings in the Tower, the same apartments where she had once dressed in cloth of gold before her coronation, had become her death row. Through the windows she could see Tower Green. Carpenters were building the scaffold where she would soon die. The view was impossible to escape. No detailed records survive describing Anne's final meals. But we know the pattern from other high-status prisoners held in the Tower. The food remained appropriate for someone of noble rank. Yet all ceremony had disappeared. Simple dishes. Basic provisions. Nothing resembling the magnificent landscape of nearly 100 dishes that had once covered the tables of Westminster Hall. No swans dressed in feathers. No sugar falcons. No gilded pastries carrying political messages. Only enough food to sustain a woman waiting for execution. The meaning of eating had changed completely. At her coronation, dining had been public theatre. Anne sat elevated beneath a royal canopy while England's greatest nobles demonstrated submission by serving her. Every bite had been watched. Every gesture recorded. Every meal presented as proof of her legitimacy. Now she still ate under observation. But it was observation of an entirely different kind. The women surrounding her were no longer servants. They were informants. Every word spoken over a meal was carefully reported to Thomas Cromwell. Every gesture examined for signs of weakness. Every emotion analyzed. The performance had changed. But Anne was still living on a stage.